These are the Founding Fathers, our political game designers. And these are their design docs, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But is their game broken? Designer's intent is a term that we use to describe how the designers imagine their game will be played, and what skills it'll reward. Rules are then crafted which encourage that intended design. Of course, it doesn't always work. In the 1946 World Series, St. Louis manager Eddie Dyer used a strategy called the infield shift against Red Sox slugger Ted Williams. This strategy loads up defenders on one side of the field in an unconventional way to better defend against hitters who tend to hit to one side of the field. It looks pretty weird, but there are no rules in baseball declaring that defenders have to stand in a specific formation. It was technically legal. This is what we call an exploit, when a player implements a strategy that stretches the norms of a game in a technically legal way to gain an advantage. Sometimes exploits are accepted by the community as just being good strategy, because while the tactic does alter the game, it doesn't stray too far from the designer's intent. The infield shift is still allowed in baseball today. Sometimes, though, an exploit is so severe that it destroys the designer's intent for the game, and when that happens, we call the game broken. This can happen in a few different ways, but the most common are strategic collapse and structural collapse. In the game StarCraft, players choose to play as one of three different species: Terrans, Zerg, and Protoss, each with their own units, buildings, and play strategies. Clearly, the designer's intent for this game was that each race would have a reasonable chance to win. But what if playing the Zerg was the only way to win? That would clearly break the designer's intent, because it would leave no reason to even bother playing Terran or Protoss. We call this scenario strategic collapse, when there's only one competitive strategy in a game that was designed to have many. But okay, say we avoid that problem, and the Terrans, the Protoss, and the Zerg are all the strategically viable armies they were intended to be. Great. But then what if you could win a game of StarCraft without building units at all, or without attacking anything? This would be another case of the designer's intent not being met, but the cause of that brokenness is something different, something that we call structural collapse. Structural collapse is what happens when a particular strategy allows you to win without using the skills that the designers intended the game to test. Structural collapse often feels like cheating that the game's rules just happen to allow. For example, Diablo 3 is a game that was supposed to be all about going into dungeons, fighting monsters, and finding better gear. But at launch, there were ways that players could avoid dungeons and fighting altogether for a very long time and still advance just by trading goods in the in-game market. Clearly not what the designers meant that game to be. So strategic collapse is a scenario where only one strategy is viable if you want to win, and structural collapse is a scenario where you can win the game without testing the intended skills. I know this is a politics show, I promise we are getting there. I'm just laying some groundwork first. For a practical example, let's look at a simple 1-mile foot race. The designer's intent is for the fastest player to win by running a mile in less time than their opponents, without using any advantage other than their training and their natural athleticism. So how do this game's rules prevent structural collapse? Well, to ensure that the tested skill is speed rather than strength, runners are not allowed to hit each other. To ensure that every participant actually runs the mile, the path is clearly marked, and players are disqualified if they cut across the middle of the track. And to ensure that unfair advantages are limited, players can't use vehicles. If any one of those rules didn't exist, we could safely call this game broken due to structural collapse. Because although the winner would still be the first person across the finish line, they might have won using a skill other than running fast. Make sense? Okay, now, finally to politics. Our democracy is, obviously, far more complex than a foot race, and unfortunately, the designers of our democracy failed at a lot of their goals. As I mentioned last time, they originally hoped to create a system in which political parties couldn't exist. Oops. But that said, falling short of certain design goals doesn't necessarily mean that the game is broken. Whether or not a game is broken depends entirely on how the designers intended the game to work. For example, our democracy's designers intended for the power of the presidency to be granted not by birth, but by state electors. And they intended for the power of the Supreme Court justice to be granted not by other judges, but by the elected president. And they intended for members of Congress to be elected not by other members of Congress, but by the voters. It ain't perfect, but that's a pretty good starting point. The basic design goals here are clear. Power is to be determined not by legacy, but either directly or indirectly through the people. And that's a pretty good idea. This core intent led to the creation of a whole slew of political mini-games, like how to choose a president and how to pass a law. And all of those mini-games are worth looking into individually to make sure that none of them are broken, but I haven't got all day here, so let's just look at one. Let's look at the minigame for electing a member of the US House of Representatives. According to this minigame's original intent, candidates should openly and peacefully pitch their ideas to voters, who should then decide which candidate they want to vote for based on the merit of those ideas. Existing House members and their political parties should have little sway in the matter. So that's the intent. And there are many strategies which candidates can use to score votes, so this process clearly does not suffer from strategic collapse. But let's look at it structurally. Every 10 years, most states redraw their congressional districts, and this is usually done by the state legislature. Using a tactic called gerrymandering, districts can be drawn to be extremely advantageous for one's own political party, which means that it confers massive benefits to the incumbent party, with little to no interaction from the people at any point. That is bad. It isn't forbidden. In fact, most states have a rule saying that every 10 years the legislature must redraw the district lines in order to take into account shifting populations. But the rule exploit of gerrymandering, while technically legal, disenfranchises voters to preserve party control. As such, the intended skill test of winning elections by pitching the best ideas to the voters has been deeply subverted. It's been replaced with a system where the players who are currently winning get to rewrite the rules for the game they're still playing. This is such a clear case of structural collapse leading to a broken game that it's really the best example I've ever seen for training young game designers. Gerrymandering is just one tool that incumbents use to retain control of their seats. If you've ever wondered why incumbent representatives have a 95% re-election rate regardless of approval ratings, this is one of the biggest reasons. So it's clear that at least some parts of our system are quite broken. What can we do about that? Join us next time for the season finale of Extra Politics as we dive right into that question. We'll see you then.